interest of time, we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for showing up for the second round of this donor advised fund panel. Just give me 1 second here. I think we have someone who is not supposed to be on. Just give me 1 moment here. Actually, Karen, do you maybe want to do the welcome and just go right into the questions from last panel, and then I can be doing this so we're not wasting any time?
Yeah, perfect. So welcome everyone. And as Serena said, thanks for joining us again. We are excited to be joined by a panel today, and we'll have each person introducing themselves shortly. But before we get into the panel content, we wanted to first go back to our session 2 weeks ago, and we had asked people to submit some questions through a form. And so we wanted to address those today and thank the folks that took the time to do that. So one question we got: once a donor advised fund is set up, can the donor change the charities that they wish to support? And the answer is absolutely yes. Donors are in no way committed to supporting the same organizations over the life of the fund. And you know, it can change with every grant every year, completely at the donor's wishes. Again, as long as it's a qualified donee, as we talked about last week. This can be particularly helpful with bequests in a will. We have a lot of donors who will name their donor advised fund as a recipient of a bequest, and then the instructions for the charities to disperse live with the Daath Foundation. So if a donor wants to make any changes to those wishes, they're not updating their will, they're simply notifying the Daath Foundation. So that's one question. We got another one around compensation. So speaking of those Daath foundations, how are they compensated for the work that they do in managing those funds, managing the grants, and spending time with the donors? So the answer, generally speaking, is that donor advised funds charge an annual administration fee that is a percentage of the assets held in the fund. This fee, or cost recovery, as is often referred, would be explicitly stated in the donor agreement that the donor signs when they establish the DAF. We had another question around communication. Who should charities be sending their marketing materials? Is it to the family, the donor? Is it the foundation that manages the DAF? Is it the financial advisor, the other legal professionals? And the answer is definitely send your materials to the family or persons that establish the DAF. Really, you want to be treating them like you would any other donor. That's a really key message. We would suggest that you do not waste your time and postage in sending materials to the Daath Foundation. At least I can speak on behalf of our foundation. Community foundations may be different, but because we're acting on the wishes of our donors, we are agnostic on the charities they're supporting. So save your materials and stamps to send them your information to the donors. And as for the financial advisors and other financial or legal tax professionals involved in the conversation, I think it's really up to the individual. So as you're establishing relationships with these people, that's a great question to ask them. Again, on cultivating relationships, if the DAF donor is deceased and we have no family contact, how do we cultivate that relationship? So I would say that this differs by DAF, but generally speaking, you know, donors are able to name a successor for their fund. And so after the original donor passes, the successor effectively steps in to that donor role. And so they would be named in any communication to the recipient charities if they wish to have their name information shared. Another tactical question about tax receipts. How do we ensure that charities are not issuing tax receipts for checks that they receive from a donor advised fund? So that is a great point, and I'm glad this question was asked. Charities should not be issuing tax receipts when they receive a gift from a donor advised fund. Remember, the donor gets a tax receipt from the foundation when they first establish their DAF. So if we've got extra tax receipts flying around, it can be confusing at tax time. So don't send those tax receipts. I know the cover letters with these checks will often reiterate that point, so just make sure you're reading those letters. Sorry if I'm going at multi-speed here. I'm just trying to get us on to the real exciting content today. The last questions we got in were pertaining to charities that are establishing their own DAFs in-house. What would motivate them to do that? What kind of staffing and resourcing do they need? We really felt that this topic was too large for today's call, so we're going to to park it. It could actually be a separate session on its own. So we'll follow up directly with the person who asked that question and point them in the direction for more information. So again, that wraps up the questions from last week's session. As I said, we just wanted to knock those out of the way before we get into the real meat today.
So thanks, Karen. Sorry about that. This is one of the pleasures of learning new technology. We are using the donor motivation account here for Canada, and that is why I think Keith popped up. I apologize for that. So if you see a logo or if you see a face that you are unfamiliar with for this panel, I do apologize. We're learning as we're going as well. So what we are going to try to do today is just explain a little bit of the flow. We have some really great panelists here who have some in-depth knowledge, diverse in-depth knowledge, and we've really tried to group the questions to allow for different perspectives on these questions to be highlighted. But I know that there will be questions that come up, and one of the things, again, that we're learning is if you're actively participating in something that is live, it's really hard to monitor the questions that are coming through. So we have our team member, Jane, that's actually going to be monitoring the chat and sending me the questions. And if we can, we're going to try to incorporate that into the topics that we've discussed based on some of the feedback that we got in the questions that Karen just brought up, and then based on the presentation that we did last week. If we don't get to them all, please know that we are recording this chat, and we will follow up individually, whether that be with the panelist or Karen or myself, to make sure that we answer all of your questions. So I know that it's hard, we have an hour, and we just wanna make sure that we're getting to all of the topics. With that, I know that I've talked a lot about this amazing panel, so I'm actually just gonna ask everyone to introduce themselves, starting with Maya Ahmad from the WWF.
Thanks, Serena, and thanks, Karen, for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'm really pleased to be here today. As folks might have seen in my bio, I've been with WWF for a long time, and I've worn many hats with the organization, but the role that has really stuck with me is the role of legacy giving. And what I love about this field is that I feel like it's partly an art, it's partly a science, as we all learn more and more through our experience, through research from each other, but there's partly some mystery to it, which also keeps it interesting. And most of all, it's the passion and commitment from the thoughtful people who give this way that's been the most meaningful for me. Having people open up to me about what's important to them, their values, their passions for wildlife and for nature, that's really opened up my eyes to why people give. And sometimes people are also sharing how they give. And that learning is part of what's brought me here today. So WWF, like many charities, has been receiving grants gratefully from donor advised funds for years, but it's only recently that we've started to take a closer look at how we could be more proactive in promoting them. So it felt very serendipitous that I met Karen when I did and had the chance to talk to her about donor advised funds and our plans to start doing more with donor advised funds. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, Maya. Okay, I think we have Janine up next.
I think that we have, sorry, and then we have Janine. We're going to be able to have a little bit of Janine from the advisor perspective.
Hi, I'm Janine Purvis, and I'm with Asante Wealth Management. I've been in the financial industry for about 20 years, actually over, and I have been really engaged in helping my clients enhance their lives with proper planning, being able to support themselves, their family, and eventually all their passions, which really led me into learning a lot more about philanthropy and charitable giving. And I know as I've grown, I've kind of been a bit of a serial volunteer anyways, always trying to give back in the community. So that really started to get me interested in working through the journey with a few of my clients. And that's how I learned about DAFs a lot more, doing homework on their behalf, so how I could help them with some of their passions. And really have been successful in helping others to learn more about it. But also in the past few years, I've been really excited to be able to redirect over $6 million to the charitable industry. So that was very exciting for me to be able to have such an impact. And actually recently I joined the Donor Motivation Program as a consultant, and having learned more about it, it seemed to fit with where I was going. So I'm really excited to be sharing some of that. And I have a few stories that I've helped clients with today that I'll be sharing with some of you.
Great, thanks, Janine. I think that's a perfect segue to Anil Gokhale from the Toronto Foundation, because he really bridges the gap, I think, from the charitable perspective and engaging with the advisor community, and even with the whole idea of donor advised funds here in Toronto and across Canada. So Anil, over to you.
Perfect. Thanks, Serena. Thanks, Karen. And thank you to the CAGP for hosting this important conversation. To all the panelists, it's really great to virtually be here with you all. And I really do hope that wherever you are, you're safe, healthy, and those around you are as well. You know, my background, so I've been, next month will be 8 years for me with Toronto Foundation. And prior to that, I was at the United Way. So I've been working in this field for almost 13 years now. And this work with donor advised funds and for me specifically to be working at an organization that's focused specifically on my city really is just the perfect combination for me. I love to be able to work with individuals and families and help them with their philanthropic legacy, but in particular, really help them find the things that really matter to them close to home. And so that's sort of the lens that I wear with my community foundation hat on. Community foundations, you know, there's a network of us, close to 200 of us across the country, over 1,000 in the US. You learned about a lot of the history at part one of this webinar. So all in all, it's an amazing sort of area to be working in. And I'm so thrilled that so many of you are excited to learn more about this and see how this tool could be used more effectively to support your clients as well as your donors, and ultimately the mission that your organization has to flourish.
Great, thanks Anil. I'm actually going to bring Karen back in and she's going to get us started with some of the questions that we have prepared.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for your introduction. So hopefully the audience has a bit of a flavor for the perspectives that we're going to bring to today's conversation. So I'd like to start with Maya at WWF. We know that for charities, they can sometimes be hesitant or they're not sure how to incorporate DAF communications when interacting with their donors. So perhaps you could just share with us how WWF has sort of changed its perspective and how have you brought your organization along the journey in terms of embracing DAFs?
Sure. Well, I must thank David Love for that, and many folks on the call are probably familiar with David. It's been a legacy legend. But a few years ago, I was on maternity leave, and David was working on our legacy team, and he launched our first digital legacy campaign through an email survey. And one of the questions was about DAFs. So what we learned from that survey was that we had a number of folks who let us know they already had a DAF. We had about 150 people say they would consider supporting our organization through a DAF. And we had over 200 people let us know that they would like to learn more about how to do that. So those results really flagged for us that there was an appetite for giving this way, and that we hadn't previously talked to our supporters about giving this way. So this was a bit of an eye-opener for us. And since then, we've been working on a way to incorporate donor-advised funds as part of our overall legacy marketing plan. So it's still early days for us, but what we've done so far is we've certainly kept the question about donor-advised funds in our survey, which goes out each year. We've added information on our legacy website, including a DAF widget, which helps connect donors really easily to the granting page for where they may want their grant, whoever's holding their grant, the foundation, sorry. We've also created a brochure and some email copy around it, and we're now working on an outreach strategy that we hope to test later this year that will drive people to these new resources and hopefully to having more conversations with us about giving this way. As for the journey, it's really been a learning process for us, and it's taken time. Like many charities, we have primarily focused our marketing on gifts and wills for many, many years. But what we're learning and what we're trying to do is, now that we have these results from our surveys, is to try to flag that people are already giving this way. So let's talk to other people about how they can also do this, and let's make sure that folks know that we will accept these gifts and that we can help them to make these gifts happen.
That's excellent. Thank you, Maya. And I know when I've heard your story about what WWF is doing, it's been really encouraging. And I know your colleagues south of the border have reached out to find out what you're doing up here, which I think is really cool, that you're kind of setting some best practices here in Canada. So I've got another question for you, Maya, and this actually came in from one of our folks who submitted a question from our last session, and it's around assessing the lifetime value of gifts. So, you know, as we think about how charities can assess lifetime value for the purposes of recognition, especially if there's no information or guarantee of an annual gift in the case of a DAF, perhaps you could just speak to what WWF is doing. I mean, it won't be the be all end all, but it'll be an example, at least for the people listening, on how it could be done.
Sure. We typically recognize donors in two ways on an annual basis through our annual report, and that's for the gift that we received from them in the past year, whether it's a gift during their lifetime or a gift from their estate. For the last several years, we also recognize new legacy commitments in our annual report, so people who've let us know within the year that they've included a gift in their will or estate, regardless if that's a beneficiary designation, regardless if they've set up a DAF or they've included us literally in their will. We include them if they've given us permission to do that. And on a case-by-case basis, we might recognize lifetime value, but it's very specific to the donor. It may be in a specific publication or at a recognition event, for example, but I think it's a really interesting question to consider lifetime value and contributions. And certainly it's one that I'd like to bring back to our team to think about more. So thanks for that good question.
Perfect. Well, thanks for sharing at least a perspective of World Wildlife Fund, and lots more conversation could be had on that topic. So changing gears a bit, and Neil, you have mentioned to me in previous conversations about how you believe DAFs can be a great planned giving tool, and CAGP is all about planned givers. So you've got an audience here that's always thinking about that. Perhaps you could expand some more on that thought for our audience. Looks like Anil's been muted here, so we're just going to open him up. You could do a little dance while we're waiting.
All right.
There you are.
Sorry, there's some street noise, so I just had muted myself while Maya was speaking. Yeah, Karen, so that is absolutely something that I think a lot about, and I think a lot of folks that work with donor advised funds definitely think that way too. You know, the way I often think about it, I actually really sort of this idea of using donor advised funds as planned giving tools really started resonating for me as I continued to think about that one stat that, you know, I'm sure many of you have heard me or the Community Foundation share at some point, but the stat is that 66% of all charitable giving in this country goes to 1% of the organizations. And what I find is that a lot of the smaller organizations that would probably find themselves looking for gift planning advice and thinking about ways that an organization like CAGP could help them, a lot of them won't necessarily have the same kind of bandwidth to really take on planned giving as part of their portfolio, because they're so focused on their annual gifts and their major gifts and sort of all the other work that they're doing to steward their current donors. Legacy sometimes is a bit of an afterthought, or for my peers on the line, you know, it might be something that you know, your boss or your board is telling you need to do, but really it's kind of just happening off the side of your desk, and there isn't really like a whole lot of effort put into it because it just can't warrant it. So a tangible example to share with you, about 3 years ago, I was put in touch with the Ovarian Cancer Society, that is a national organization, but headquartered here in Toronto. And one of their donors, a gentleman who had lost his wife to the disease, wanted to remember her and create something as a memorial for her. And so what ended up happening was the fund, the gentleman created a fund at the Community Foundation, so at Toronto Foundation, and named it after his late wife. But then what he did was he put all the money into it, and then every year he would make a grant from that fund, and it would basically be designated to Ovarian Cancer Society. And so what ends up happening then is that Ovarian Cancer Canada doesn't need to worry about the sort of day-to-day stewardship of that endowment, but instead they continue to work with their donor who they have a relationship with, but he just happens to have his sort of endowment side of his business or of his gift taken care of by a third party, which happens to be us. I'm sure I'll talk about this later in this webinar, but we work very closely with a lot of charities in the community in Toronto, but then also some national organizations too, about 45 in total, where we provide sort of support to them to basically take on their endowments and manage them and provide really good fees and all that stuff. And so there's a model here where I'm speaking on behalf of Toronto, but I know Hamilton Community Foundation does this. I know Vancouver does this, like wherever you are in the country. And I know this is the GTA roundtable, but just know that, that's what we're here to do, is to really serve our peers in the sector.
That's a great example, Anil, and certainly I'm sure you're open to taking an email or a call from anyone watching who wants to learn a little bit more about this for their organization. So thanks for that.
Yeah. And actually, Karen, just one last thing. Just in this last sort of 11 weeks, I've probably had about 5 or 6 of those very calls with other organizations that are here in the city, peers of all of ours that are looking to do just this.
That is perfect. And Maya, I believe you had an example at WWF as well around kind of a planned giving opportunity. So perhaps you could tell us about that.
Sure. One of my first experiences learning about donor advised funds was about 10 or 12 years ago. And we had a family who wanted to set up a named fund at WWF for their daughter who had died unexpectedly. She had included a gift in her will and for WWF, and family and friends had made donations in her memory. So we had a policy, a policy about endowments and named funds, and unfortunately it's not our area of specialty, right, to host these types of funds, and the gift amount didn't match. So our director at the time said, what if we do this through the Toronto Foundation? And then WWF could be named as the grantee. And so that is what we did. And it's been many years since we set up that fund. So WWF staff worked with the family, worked with the foundation, the Toronto Foundation staff, and created a fund. And we've had some quiet years where we lost touch with the donor and where we didn't see any of the granting dollars come in, because as mentioned, it's up to the donor to activate the release of those gifts. But recently we have a multi-year agreement with the family to use those funds that Toronto Foundation distributes annually to us for a special project that the family helped to name in honor of their daughter. And it's actually one of my most treasured relationships now. So that was my first experience. And more recently, I've also had a number of calls recently about from donors, and some of them have let me know how they're setting up a donor advised fund to simplify and consolidate their charitable giving as they get older, so they don't have to sit down and write so many checks or think about what they're going to do. And they've let me know how the DAF allows them to combine their favorite beneficiaries within one account. And I've also found it interesting to hear the variety of ways that they can set up those DAFs. So one person let me know it was going to distribute for 5 years, whether he was alive or not. And another donor let me know hers would be in perpetuity. And others have talked to me about using securities to help fund their DAFs. So it's really been an interesting number of conversations about how people are choosing to use DAFs to support their charitable giving.
That's great. And that's a nice breadth of examples kind of for the folks on the line to hear. Maya, we had a question come in on the chat from your previous remarks about this widget on your website. Is that something you could describe, take a few more moments describing that, or is it really still in development, so tough to talk about?
No, it's just it was created by an agency partner that we're working with, and what it allows people to do is type in the name of the DAF Foundation. So if it was Toronto Foundation, they can type in Toronto Foundation, and it will just link them directly to the granting page. So then they could see whatever's on the granting page. If it says, hey, call Anil, it just takes the one step, it removes one step for the donor from our page wanting to support wildlife conservation to making the grant.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So again, removing those barriers and making it easy for your donors. That's a great example. Okay, thank you. Now, Janine, you've been sitting there patiently. We've got some questions for you now. So we've heard from both Anil and Maya about planning and kind of this planning process in gift planning. So we can only imagine how much planning goes on with the client. So you as their trusted advisor and you know, including when they're going the DAF route. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about what that planning process looks like and the journey for your client, the donor.
Well, I feel like their planning is wonderful, but often we're starting way back at square one. So I think there's sort of two avenues here that I need to address. The first is a lot of clients are generous and are giving. And if you are doing planning with your client, you're looking at their tax returns, you're understanding what their engagement is in their community. And often it's triggered by a specific event. Maybe they've inherited more money and now they're starting to rethink where they want to be due to a death or a change. They've sold the business, they're retiring, and they know they are in a really good position. So now they want to fill their time. So there's different things that they're going to be coming about, but it's usually events, life events, often that will trigger more planning and more thought. So it's not just about the money. I mean, obviously that's wonderful, the more they can give, but it's really about what is their passion and how do they want to get engaged. And I think the thing that we often assume is those people who've done it before will do it again, which isn't always the case, because now they're not working if they just retired. They might be scared to give as much money. So there has to be more planning involved. But the other thing is a lot of people came from a very humble background, and they might have been very generous in many ways based on what they had, but they weren't generous in the bigger ways because they didn't think they could. And I've come across that. That's probably the most frequent thing I've come across where I've actually helped clients to set up donor advised funds that they never thought they could. And it's amazing to open up their eyes to all the ideas and what they can do and the impact they can have. So that's one of the things that I think has been most rewarding, but there's a lot of steps in that planning process. So I think it's really important to consider those. The other thing I think is that clients, you have to go through a long process of understanding the client with the planning as well, because most people don't understand what DAFs are. They're starting to get more awareness now, but maybe there's an article that you can refer them to just to explain the basics. Because I would say at least 9 times out of 10, if not 10, every time I've mentioned ideas about charitable giving and philanthropy and how they can enhance this, or they're asking me what they can do, if DAFs come up, they don't understand it, so they often shut the door right away. So it's more about understanding what their priorities are when they're planning. Is this something that's going to enhance their retirement life? They want to be involved, they want to be volunteering, but they still want to give. So you have to figure out what their priorities are, what their passions are, and then try to match all of those. I mean, that gets into the whole other side that you guys don't get involved in, but it's still a really important process. And also, sometimes we think it's about the money, but it's really more about their interests and their focus and their objectives. So my role, what I think, is try to figure out what their priorities are and how they want this philanthropic journey to go, and then start to look at the best ways. Some people, it's obvious there's a huge one situation and maybe there's one charity, but one client I had, they were very interested in Indigenous rights and homeless and in the city, but also in different areas. So when we started to look at it, they didn't even know enough about the charities they wanted to donate to. So that's where and also we were going to be doing this in terms of the donations were going to be over a period of time. So in their case, it really made sense for a DAF, simply because it allowed them to do homework, take time. It met all their criteria, right? So there's lots of different pieces to think about. So I'll leave it at that, but there's lots more I can share at some point.
Yeah, and you've certainly hit on a lot of the reasons why a DAF might make sense for a donor or a client when they need, they've had this event and they've come into some money, but they want the time to research the organizations they want to support. Mm-hmm. And I know we're going to come back to that later, and you're going to share a specific example to make it real. But another thing you said there about how in many cases, these are donors who, or clients who have been very generous in other ways, but maybe financially they haven't been able to support their clients. And so this, they come into some some money for whatever reason, and then they can use that DAF to really structure their giving in the future, because it's not something that they really know how to do it yet, and they need some time. So that's really exciting. So we'll come back to more of your examples later. So I'm going to pass it over to Serena to keep the conversation going.
Thanks so much, Karen. And Janine, I think just understanding kind of the complexities that go on kind of behind the scenes when the clients who are also donors are considering something like a donor advised fund, I think it really hits on the point that the complexity is really there. So my next question is for Anil, who looks like he's muted. So just give me 1 second here. Yeah, so my next question for you, Anil, is really trying to understand how important it is to really engage with the allied professional network. Because as in Janine's example, you really saw her kind of diving deep, not only on the personal exploratory side of the conversation, but then having to factor in all of the financial elements. And I think the product of a donor advised fund is really crucial when you start to look at all of the people who have, for lack of a better phrase, their hands in the pot, that need to have a conversation to make sure that it's being executed correctly. So if you could give any examples or how the Toronto Foundation has approached this, it would be really helpful, I think, for many people listening in the audience.
For sure. The Allied Professional or Professional Advisor Network is so critical. It is absolutely imperative that all donor advised fund producers or providers, but as well, every single charity on this call build relationships with these folks. They very much are the gateways, as Janine was talking about, to clients that are looking to really do good and to make an impact in the communities that they care about. And so, some very kind of just I want to give some just very tangible examples to really articulate this. And I want to shout somebody out on this call right here, Keith Thompson, who has been a long time friend and supporter of the Community Foundation. And in particular, what I think is really exciting is over the years, the amount of his clients that have found their way over here, obviously by way of him, where we're able to provide really just a really immersive and perfect experience for them and their families to kind of accomplish what it is they want to do. And I'd say, in the last couple of years in particular, when, Keith has continued to send clients our way, it's even more amazing now because, as some of you may know, Stonegate or Asante does have sort of their own in-house donor advised fund that they're offering now, where they're working with our friends at Benefaction. And so Karen's on the line here as well. But what's really great is that Keith and his peers, they know their clients and they know what their clients are looking for. And so when that client is saying things like, I really want to dive into the issues in Toronto, or I'm really focused on, as Janine was saying, like imagine a client is talking about the homelessness issue or Indigenous rights, etc. Keith knows, right, that the level of detail and the level of sort of understanding that he is going to be able to provide his clients is going to hit a ceiling, and that's where someone like us can really step in and provide that support. And so shout out to Keith. And then the other person I would definitely shout out is somebody else that you all know is Malcolm Burrows. Malcolm is at Scotia and obviously has an in-house option through the Aqueduct Foundation, and at least once a quarter, our phone rings and it's Malcolm on the other line saying, hey, I've got a client who, longtime Scotia client, does X, Y, and Z, etc. But based on what they're saying, based on what they want to do, it really feels like a good fit for them to be at the Community Foundation for this part of their philanthropy. And so, that tells me that, these advisors know intimately what their clients are looking for, and then can sort of really support them in the best way possible. The allied professionals that offer donor advised funds, many of them, a few others are on the line here, many of them, can absolutely provide really great service to their clients to help them do the things that they want to do, give to causes like WWF and others. And it's so seamless. And I think the last thing I want to say on the allied professional piece is that oftentimes it's really sort of this part of the conversation I find is generally always focused on investment advisors, and they do carry a lot of weight and have a lot of sort of say in this planning work. But we definitely need to remember as well, there's so many other elements of that pie, and whether it's the estate law community, tax accountants, insurance providers, you name it. There's so many folks that support these clients and support people through this planning, and philanthropy comes up in any one of those conversations. And so building and maintaining those relationships with all of those groups of advisors is really important.
Great, thanks, Anil. And I might bring Maya here into this conversation a little bit too. So you spoke about Malcolm and Keith, who are obviously well known within the CAGP community. But I'm just wondering, if someone was to say, okay, I understand that the professional network is something that I need to engage in, whether again, that be insurance advisors, financial advisors, investment advisors, accountants, legal, etc. Is there anything tangible that you would say, like where to start? Because I know for myself and Keith, and I know Janine can probably relate to this as well, we get asked to go to a lot of charitable kind of advisor networking events. And I know that the Toronto Foundation has taken a couple of really unique approaches to this. Could you, if someone was just starting out, where would you say would be kind of where they should start out, Anil?
And so, Serena, just to clarify, you're speaking specifically from the lens of an advisor who's really starting to think through their work in philanthropy.
So I'm thinking, so there's the twofold question, I guess I should say, is one, I think it would be really great if you could say, how do you promote it as a charity, trying to connect with those advisors who aren't already so engaged within the philanthropic community? So someone like Malcolm and Keith have been part of the community for a really long time. So if there's someone kind of wanting to reach out to the advisor network, but kind of grasp at people who aren't as engaged, how would you start the conversation there?
Certainly. So one thing that I certainly think what I'm about to say certainly works to the advantage of donor advised funds, and probably not so much to the specific cause-based charities out there. But one thing is that for a lot of advisors that are working with their clients, advisors, it's really difficult for an advisor to find themselves in a position where they are suggesting, giving to cause A or supporting cause B. They don't necessarily want to go there, right? Like they want to talk about planning and effective, sort of stewardship in that regard, but that sort of next level of, well, I support this organization, so you should too. Most advisors don't typically go there because they just, every client is going to have different things that they're thinking about and focused on. So I think where donor advised funds really play well for advisors is that donor advised funds are cause agnostic. Donor advised funds typically are, like it's the Wong Family Foundation that now from the foundation, the Wong family might decide, oh, I want to give to WWF and this cause and that cause and this cause. And so, but the advisor isn't saying, hey, you should give to WWF. And so from an advisor's perspective, I think that's where donor advised funds can actually be a really effective tool for their toolbox. And obviously that's of great benefit to me and lots of other people who provide donor advised funds. But I think I say all that, but then I also want to make sure I say that all of us donor advised funds, the whole reason we are here is because we want to move money into the charitable sector. And the only reason we're here is that. And so, while we're here to support our clients and take those funds and manage them, it really is then to grant the money and get it out where it needs to go. And so I can certainly speak on behalf of community foundations where I know all of the important work that we're doing across the country with, focused efforts through Vital Signs here in Toronto and other things. And so that's kind of one way I think that I would probably answer that question, Serena. And I just want to touch on Uday in the chat asked a question of clarification that I just want to make sure I underscore. So Uday, what you were asking was just around, so I'll read it in case people can't read the chat. Can you please clarify the example with respect to Malcolm Burrows? Why would a donor who works with Scotia Wealth Management want to give through Toronto Foundation instead? And so in that scenario, sort of just to underscore the conversation I was suggesting happens, Malcolm would call us because Malcolm knows that his client, like the signs that his client is giving him are signs of, I want to dive deeper into issues of importance here in Toronto. I need help finding the right organizations. I need help really navigating all this. And, you know, Malcolm quickly, and other donor advised fund producers for that matter, quickly realize we're not well positioned to do this. And so we're going to go and find somebody that is. And in this case, in the example I'm sharing, it was Toronto Foundation. It may not always be, but that is just an example of why it would be suggested to that donor. Ultimately, it's the donor's decision whether or not they want to come to us, but that's sort of how it played out.
Yeah, and given the fact that you come from the Toronto Foundation's perspective, I just want to maybe quickly get Maya's perspective, because I know that you have for a long time with David done a really great job of engaging with advisors. So I just didn't know if you had any tidbits of insights regarding this from a charitable perspective of how you deal with the allied professionals.
I would say we have really tried to engage on a case-by-case basis. So when we have an opportunity to meet, whether it's through networking or through some of our events, to make a connection and to get to know people, we try and maintain those relationships so that we actually know a person to reach out to who could either help us or possibly redirect us to other folks in the advisor community. And that has seemed to work for us so far. But we've tried to engage other folks on our development team as well, right? So when our corporate partnerships team is having an event, for example, we might talk to them and say, are there other folks that we can bring in from an advisor community that this might appeal to, that sort of thing. So trying to integrate it beyond just the legacy giving sort of portfolio.
No, and I think that's a really great point. This is an and, it's not an or. So I think the more that you can integrate it across all fields, which I think is a great example that you gave Maya, and then to Anil's conversation about, you know, how some advisors in the community might actually go to a community foundation or another organization, understanding that it might be more well suited for the client's needs. So with that, I'm actually I think this kind of flows really well into the next conversation, which I'm gonna hand over to Karen to take the reins here.
Okay, so back to Janine, talking about some client examples. When you spoke earlier, and we certainly touched on this 2 weeks ago, the idea of separating some form of liquidity event from the giving event, and giving donors time to deal with whatever's happening personally in their life, and then they can move on to the exciting and rewarding part of giving. And I know that you have a recent example of a client that you've been working with, and would just love to hear a little bit more about kind of what was going through their mind, why a donor advised fund made sense, and really what the outcome of that was.
Okay. I'm going to share 2 different scenarios, and they have a little bit of a different driver, but I think they both help people to see the different cases that we might be looking at. I guess the first case that I'll address happened fairly recently, about a year ago. And what happened was this client was going through some challenging times, but had a positive situation where their business was selling. And it was selling for a considerable amount of money, far more than they ever anticipated. Yet they were dealing with the unfortunate event where the husband actually had a terminal illness in making so they were making these decisions on selling the business while they were dealing with all these healthcare issues. So it was a really, really traumatic time. The sale of the business was going to close on a certain date. And we realized when they were dealing with the taxes and everything that was going on, that they had a lot on their plate. Making any big decisions was going to be really challenging, but they had also been very generous people over the years and big believers in philanthropy. So just by suggesting, my wealth planning team and I simply suggested that there may be a way to save tax, since it was going to have a very large tax hit, by doing some charitable giving, especially since their income was going to be changed once they sold the business. Seemed to all make sense. We just basically planted a seed or 2. And they decided we should look at that. We literally had 45 days for them before the tax deadline was going to hit, and that we knew that they had too much on their plate to make any big decisions. So really all we did was focus on how much they should be giving. We did some calculations, focused on the best way of considering giving. And even though we knew they believed in certain charities, that was too big a decision to make. So decided instead to break it down into looking at donor advised funds. And then it took time for them to understand them. As I said, most people don't have much background. And really just identifying which donor advised fund was going to be the best solution for us. I had been lucky enough to work with another client and done a lot of homework on certainly not all of them. So if many of you are on the call, I don't know all of them in the industry, but trying to find donor advised funds that have different focuses. So had known well about the Toronto Community Foundation, had looked at a few other priorities. And so I could identify the key where each, the different donor advised funds that I knew, where they brought some benefits. And that's really what it came down to. What were the client's priorities? What can we deal with now? And this was a way for them to make the decision to focus on the money and what had to be done and give them time to address all of the other stuff. So that's kind of how that one came to be. We're still in the process with that one.
And the beauty with the DAF versus say a private foundation is you can get that DAF account opened in 24 hours as opposed to waiting a year for a private foundation. So sometimes when donors are making that trade-off, that can be the benefit. So we're just doing a time check. We're at 12:47 for everyone on the call. Janine, I think you had a second example that you
Yeah, I'd like to share that one. This one was a situation where, remember I said, many clients don't come from wealthy backgrounds. This family was extremely generous with their time and had always given, but they never thought they could give a lot. And really, it was only through planning as we were approaching their retirement that we realized they had recently inherited more money and now we're in a different position. And it just opened their eyes to different ideas. So what we ended up doing is we started looking at options. They had a priority where they know they wanted to give money, but they weren't confident how much they could give. It really depended on a number of factors. So we had to look at that. So we were going to be giving over a 10-year period and possibly more if everything went well. And they also had the priority that the funds needed to be invested in something that was socially responsible investing. So that became our priority because we had a timeline, and because this is one of the scenarios that I mentioned about Indigenous family and homelessness. They didn't know enough about the charities in that industry. So we started the process when they had wanted to take advantage of a tax break on a specific situation, knowing that it was going to be a longer term endeavor. And that journey has continued. They're continuing to look at what they're doing. We specifically chose tithes simply because they were one of the few donor advised funds that had socially responsible investing at the time. I've since learned a few more, but that's the whole process. So, and they also wanted more consultative opportunities, which they were also able to provide and had some expertise. So again, that's where, it wasn't about me and finding those opportunities. It's about making sure we're satisfying what are the client's priorities and what are their needs. And by allowing them to make smaller decisions one at a time, it's often easier to get a bigger buy-in. It's also easier for estate planning because they can make changes in their will. They don't have to change it every time they change their charity, right? They've got a donor advised fund. Now we can just sign a piece of paper. We don't have to pay a lot of money to a lawyer every time we want to make a change. So there's a number of reasons where they're beneficial. I realize it doesn't apply to everybody, and that's part of what prioritizing what the client's needs are.
Right, and you've definitely highlighted that DAFs are not one size fits all, that there are different providers out there and they make sense in different situations. With 10 minutes left, we're starting to come on a time constraint, but I will ask you one last thing, Janine, to answer in like 10 words. When these two client situations you've talked about, like how has that impacted your relationship with your clients to be able to experience this with them?
I feel like we're really going through not just the financial planning journey, but their life journey. It's enhanced relationship. In one case, they don't have any kids, but I actually did a video where I just highlighted working with clients in this scenario, and I asked the approval of the one client, because even though it's sort of blending sources, and they were so excited that they were a part of it, even though it was generically, that they asked if they could share it with their friends.
Yeah.
So I thought that was wonderful. I thought, oh God, they might not want me to say anything. It sounds like I'm talking about them, even though it wasn't absolutely. So that was positive. And in the other case, honestly, because this is a family legacy, that the way we're approaching this staff, it's really, really meaningful in terms of the husband who did pass away. Literally a few days after the business sale closed. It was very traumatic. The kids are now involved. They're adults, and they're actually making this a journey at finding those charities that are really hitting home with what's important in the memory of their father. So like all of that, I've been able to share. So that's been really rewarding.
Yes, I can only imagine.
More
Over
than
to you,
10 words,
Serena.
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay.
It's okay, but I think it's actually, I don't have to talk that much to give you a little bit of context, because my next question is for Neil. We've talked a lot about, liquidity events and when capital becomes available to allocate to a donor advised fund, but I want to talk a little bit about how it doesn't always have to be a large sum of money, and what the Toronto Foundation has done to really use the donor advised funds as a catalyst to uncover next gen philanthropy, and maybe even get into some new arenas with it. I think this is a really important point. Now that we're in probably the third or fourth year of it, that you have some concrete data on it.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, I think a great way to answer this is to just really underscore in the chat. I would encourage you all to read what Jody Guyot, I think I pronounced that correctly, wrote.
Yeah.
Just around sort of this idea of really thinking about values, and really sort of engaging conversations at that level. So for us, what we really wanted to do was take the donor advised fund product that we sell, that we have, and really think, how can it be packaged in a way that really provides some real value for the folks that we're trying to engage in this conversation. Now, what's really important to sort of really talk about is, typically, I think for a lot of people, like that younger segment of donors is just kind of ignored, right? And we sort of focus on, people in their 60s, 70s, nearing retirement, retired, have more time on their hands, all that stuff. And I think what we really, just really understood really quickly as we went into this was, gone are those days. Like, there are so many 20, 30, 40-year-olds that really want to do it now and want to keep working, but they also want to give, and they want to integrate those things, and they want to be more involved. But for a lot of them, I think the challenge is just navigating. Like, there's so much information out there and so many things that they could get involved in. And I mean, that's the same for people of older generations too, but like, there's just so much coming at us all the time. And this is back to that notion of cause agnostic. Like, again, like we sort of took advantage of that, I would say, and really tried to build something that would be of service and value to people that we were looking to engage in the program. And the whole idea, I describe it often as a philanthropic MBA. And so we literally have created a curriculum that people come on board and they sign up, they create their donor advised fund. So they sign up to a $10,000 endowment to get started. And then they go on what we call a learning journey. And I often describe it as, it's a way for them to build a foundation for their foundation. And that's really sort of at the core. And so we have literally created this curriculum where we help people think about their own personal values and how those connect to their giving. We really help people unpack their own privilege and their power as it relates to their philanthropy, and what that dynamic looks like of like donor giving to organization, and sort of understanding that. We dive into socially responsible investing and impact investing. We talk about granting. So we have this whole curriculum, and the first cohort was in 2018, and the program was called Vision 2020, and that group graduated just a few months ago in December. Proudly, my friend Serena is a member of that cohort, and my wife Nicole and I also participated. So that was really neat for me to be running the program, but also do it myself. And we had 115 people participating in that between the ages of 23 and 51. So it very much spanned the millennial Gen X cohort. What we really realized, though, is that a program like this, sure, it's of value to certain demographics, but it's not exclusive to just age. And so what we realized pretty quickly is there's a certain value set that actually is really the more connective tissue. And so in the second iteration of the cohort, which is going underway right now, we have another 100+ people participating, but we stripped off the sort of the age moniker, let's say. And so the bulk of people that are in it are still very much in the millennial Gen X cohort, but we have, you know, some folks in their later 50s, 60s, and 70s as well that are participating, and they're running through their curriculum right now. Our next session is via Zoom just next week, actually. And then sometime in the fall, we'll start recruiting for the next cohort, which will start in January. And so that's sort of in a nutshell a way that we've packaged the donor advised fund to really sort of provide value to sort of folks at an earlier stage of their philanthropic journey.
Great, thanks, Anil. And just in the interest of time, I want to make something really clear about that. And maybe I'm a little biased because of just being part of the initial cohort. But I think what was really great from an organizational perspective in the charitable sector is the fact that you're not only helping people along on this learning journey, but you're also stewarding them along as well to be advocates for the organization. So whether you are, you know, a community foundation or a charitable foundation, the more you can, or the earlier you can engage in the conversation with that next gen that wants to be part of it, the longer you'll have over the life cycle of that donor. So I think that's a really important point. I know that we're at 12:57 and I'm really hoping that I can end this on time. So really quickly, I'd love to ask the panelists and actually Karen this question, because when Karen and I set out to do this whole project, we just really wanted to debunk some of the myths and just open up the conversation and make it more approachable. So Karen, I'm going to start with you. What is the one thing that you want people to leave this discussion with?
I think it's important to kind of go back in history and remember that donor advised funds started as an instrument of the charitable sector, starting with community foundations. It's supported by financial partners, but this isn't a financial instrument. It's a charity sector instrument. And I think that's really important. And knowing that this is legally bound dollars for the charitable sector and it's growing. And so that's really exciting because these are dollars that will end up with those organizations that need it.
Great. And then over to you, Maya. Same question for everyone.
I guess I would hope that people would be curious. If folks in the charitable sector like me have legacy giving and a portfolio of things, to actually spend a bit of time and do a bit of digging and see in your donor base who's already giving this way, and to take the time to pick up the phone when you get those grant letters, to learn about that gift, to make a connection with the advisor who's helping to facilitate that gift, and then to pick up the phone and call that donor and to learn more about them and why they've chosen to give this way can really help to make a case for what, if your organization is looking to do more with DAFs.
Okay, and Janine, last but certainly not least. I guess we have Neil as well there too.
I think I just want to share for advisors that are in the group and charities that are listening. Sometimes I think advisors' challenges are they don't want to donate to the DAF. And Neil addressed that, giving that question. We don't want to bias the client because it's really trying to help them find their priorities. But I think the most important thing is that whether I'm dealing with a DAF that's going to affiliated with my own firm or I'm dealing with an outside one, at the end of the day, I consider if I'm doing what's in the client's best interest, it's all going to help me anyways, right? So it's not about maintaining the assets, and I think sometimes that's what charities have are worried about. But I think it's really important to make sure if we're doing what's in the client's best interest, it's all going to work out better for everybody.
Great, thanks, Janine. And Anil, sorry about that. I'll throw it over to you. I feel like I see you all the time, so.
That's okay. I actually just want to build on something. So Serena, I thank you for sort of sharing the additional couple sentences after I finished talking about the Next Gen program. And the thing I think I want to underscore based on what Serena said is, so donor advised funds, and I can say this from first person with Toronto Foundation and all my community foundation peers, and I'm fairly certain the rest will agree. When we are talking to our clients and our donors actually, and we're helping them with their giving, we're giving them ideas, etc. I know what we do is we always get them thinking about things like really first principles. So multi-year commitments, unrestricted funding, like those are the kinds of things that we are drilling home with donors. And I think it's really important for donor advised funds are a vehicle, but I think ultimately that money is going where it's most needed. And we want to make sure that it's going with as little strings attached as possible, ideally none. And that's something that is really important. And I think the education of the donor community and of clients is really key on that. And so we're really waving that flag, and I know all of you are as well. And so that's a really important piece that I think is really important just to stress.
Great. And I'm just going to, Karen, I hope this is okay, but I'm just going to kind of wrap it all up. And the way that I'm going to, and this is something that Anil actually said, I guess it would almost be in 2019 in the summer, the concept of the intergenerational transfer of values is something that we hold really, really dear to our hearts. And I think that people across this panel will agree to that. So the Donor Advised Fund is not only, it's a tool for us to, whether that be at a liquidity event or whether that be through education, the Donor Advised Fund is an opportunity for us to have some really great conversations with our clients who are also your donors and vice versa. So I hope that today provided a little bit of clarity. I know that there were some questions in the chat that we didn't have time for, but we will follow up with everyone who asked a question. And then of course, if people do have questions, please use the email that will be sent around to everyone, and we'll be happy to direct you to the appropriate people. But lastly, I would love to thank Anil, Janine, Maya, and of course my wonderful co-host, Karen, for agreeing to be part of this and all of your hard work. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.